Here we are, Jason. I think we're live.
This is awesome. Hello, Gary. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. It's Sunday afternoon. I'm in London, Ontario. You are in Hamilton. And we're both sitting in rooms filled with books. This is lovely. Thank you for coming. This is exciting. We've chatted before. I think the last time we had an interview was in the basement of the bookshop when it was a block north of us, where we are now, in that creepy wood-paneled basement on Richmond Street. And you met my dog Snackers, I believe, that day.
It was great. I felt like at any moment, some sort of creepy thing could come out from under the floorboards, or I could be trapped and dismembered. It made a very exciting literary reading. It's perfect way to talk about books.
That's precisely the mood that we were trying to establish in that basement. There's a moment, that was for the International Festival of Authors, if I recall, and it was being filmed, I believe, very professionally. Of course, it was in in this, serial killer basement. And my favorite part is where you're reading and everything's very professional. This is a wonderful organization, the International Festival of Authors. And in the middle of it, there's the crowd. I believe Josh was there too. There's a crowd. And all of a sudden you see this tail kind of come into the frame. And then my dog actually jumps up on your lap and wants you to pet it, which you did. And I thought that was very lovely.
I'm always very responsive to audience. What can I say? The worst reading I ever did, I was doing this reading, and I honestly really don't complain about readings. I mean, people are always trying to do the best, they organize it the best they can. And so I don't know why. It was in this long, narrow room. For some reason, I complained to the organizers, well, I couldn't see and I couldn't this, and the audience wasn't paying much attention. And I said, Gary, considering at the back of the room, while you're reading, somebody had a heart attack. The EMS came in, took them out on a stretcher. The audience paid quite good attention. I felt, just really good about myself after that. Yeah.
You didn't cause the heart attack, though, with your grand performance, I imagine, though.
I mean, I hope to have, push people's hearts to the very edge of what they can take. Absolutely. And the thing actually about that bookstore reading, which I really liked also, was I was reading from the draft of the book that we're going to talk about today. It was like
exactly
in the middle of it. So that was a really, to think about like the life of the book. So from the idea to the draft and the way it maybe interacts with people and how it changes maybe through that interaction and discussion, and then to when the book actually comes out, and then whatever kind of afterlife it has, in Remainderville or in out in the world as it does its own thing. It's kind of interesting.
The town of Remainderville is a strange town, I imagine. Just books filled with like black magic markers on the bottom of them, piles of the unsaleable books. have you found? So and I do want to talk to you about that night too, and the draft. That's one of my questions. The draft that you had that night, but what did you feel like? I'm going to ask you this question. Have you gone in? I imagine you've gone into a used bookstore and found a book that you wrote in a used bookstore. And have you had the experience where you've inscribed it to someone and you know that they sold it? And or what did you feel when you first found a work?
Well, I called my mother up right away and said, "Mom, you can't give away that from your loving son." No, used bookstores are really interesting because in one sense it's like, oh, somebody parted with my book. How could they? They're supposed to keep it close. Yeah, especially dedication. On the other hand, used bookstores are part of the world of books, where books and ideas and stories are in circulation. So there's something lovely about it being part of the broader culture. So right. Of course, on one level, yeah, my needy needing for approval, like, of course, it has a pride of place always for somebody. But really, if it goes out into the broader culture and it does whatever it does, and people read, sometimes people keep books forever. Sometimes they read it and then they move it on because they, for whatever reason. So, like, I understand that, and there's, there's so many books out there in the world. Another story I remember, I had a poetry book printed with. Published by Coach House, and I was taking a friend around to show them Coach House, this famous bookstore and this famous publisher in Toronto. Yeah. And my son was there, who was about 14, I think, at the time. And as we looked in the window of the Coach House, they're unusual in that they're a press, but they also physically print the books, in house. So we looked in the window, and the cover of my book was like actually being printed as we looked in. It was so cool. So we went in, and then all the rest, the insides of the books were on the floor. And my son said, "Well, Dad, why don't you just take all of that stuff and bring it right to our basement? Because that's where it's going to end anyway, and skip that middle." That's but books, books have a life, and they do different things. And I think it's really interesting. It's not just like they end up in a bookstore, they end up in somebody's house, and all of the paths that the ideas, the books, the stories take. I find it really, it's a really lovely story, or kind of a fascinating story, of how things get there, and how people, like people lending books, or there's books that, I remember I was complaining to the same son that he was taking my books when he moved away from home. He was taking these books. Like, I was like, what? And then he said, "Yeah, Dad, look at these books. Some of these books you took from your parents." So it was kind of lovely. Like, just that's the thing, is books, are shared and go into the world in different ways. And that, I think that's part of it, right? That's what we would want.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And that night of the interview, in that creepy basement, I remember asking you what you were working on next, and it was the book that we're talking about today, and it was in draft form at that time, I believe. So, what was the? Are you comfortable comparing sort of what we have now, which is a finished product? What shape was it in when you were at our shop that
Yeah,
night?
no, it's interesting, because when you read, something in draft to somebody, depending, the act of reading it itself, you realize things about how it sounds like on stage, as it were, in front of people. And depending on the particular people, you have a different sense. Like, I definitely have a different sense of the book, as I see how it works. It's like you're telling a joke, and you tell the joke, and you see how it, depending who you tell it to, you see that you need to change it, you need to modify it. It works, or it doesn't work. It sounded better in your head, or it didn't. In fact, it worked better. Different things work better. So that experience of like taking it out and trying it out really is helpful to me. No, people don't even have to say anything about it. I just have the sense, and I have the sense of how they might be imagining it. And so I find that really, like, that's really helpful. So I think one of the things, because I remember I read the first section, and the difference now is I made it. While many of the things I thought were well written, then I had worked on them, and enough that I would be willing to read them to people.
Yeah.
I realized it wasn't quite as, first of all, it moved more slowly. It needed it kind of tightening, and I wanted to kind of like, grab the audience by the lapels, kind of, and start the story. And there's because that was a sense of really telling a story to somebody, really like saying, like, gather around, and I've got this, you'll never believe this. This is what happened. So I think that was one thing that I could really tell, that I read it things out loud to myself, but I'm either more of an indulgent listener or less of an indulgent listener, depending on my mood, I suppose. So I really did a lot of polishing and cutting things out and moving things around since I read it. And so it's, as for me, it's also, there's like an echo of that original draft in my memory. Like, I think of it as, if you look at somebody who's grown up and you remember what they were like when they were a kid, and you sort of
Right.
see you see the little person as well as the adult person. And I feel like I hear that in my book. But now it's, I think I've really been able to, it's about really knowing what it's about, and what, like, really focusing what the music of the text, I guess. And so that those are the things that really help me. And if the music of the text is also the music of the thinking, the way ideas connect to each other, and storytelling. And so, yeah, I find that a lovely experience to read in person to people, for drafts, for exactly that reason, even if they're not as polished as the ultimate one. But I think there's something that maybe about the rawness that I hope that the audience can get when they hear something rough, that they hear these connections that are almost but not quite, and it's like, feels like a work in the process of being made. Sometimes it's just really dull, but hopefully they can see. It's sort of, I think, for me, I like that experience about getting a sense of a narrative, a story, or a text on its way to becoming something. That's kind of an interesting experience, I think.
Um, I should say the name of the novel, Nothing the Same, Everything Haunted. That's the book we're talking about. And it really does have that quality of someone leaning in and telling you a story. And your choice of, using, cowboy and Western genre, as well as sort of the travel narrative as sort of ways to, I guess, mount that story in some fashion. It is very interesting. So would you be able to tell us a little bit about how you became attracted to those genres with this project specifically, and how they functioned?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, the book tells it's set in the Holocaust. It's set in 1941 in Lithuania. So, first of all, I wanted to think about how to address the Holocaust and try and find a way in. And sometimes when writing about the Holocaust, I think it sort of calcifies. It's like, okay, there's only one way that you should write about it. You need to like light a candle, bow your head, and be very like, because of course it's this, immense tragedy, but then it becomes calcified and you don't really feel it, and it loses its immediacy and its kind of power of the telling, because it becomes like it's all truism. And so, first of all, to unpack that, I also had, as a writer, I was thinking about when I'm thinking about writing another novel, what really was an important thing to write about. So I really wanted to somehow think of a way of addressing Indigenous genocide, but without, putting my colonial settler boots all over it, to find some sort of way to maybe approach the subject, but with that, appropriately. And then I came across Karl May's writing. Karl May was a German Western writer, the most popular writer in German. He was the most popular. It was his book sold the most, other than the Bible. And he had many people from late 19th century up to the present day, people who love his books. He was Hitler's favorite author. Hitler brought the books to the bunker under Berlin. He sent them to his officers on the Eastern Front. It's kind of so the idea, they're kind of are noble savage tropes. So it's about these indigenous people. Winnetou is this beautiful warrior indigenous person with amazing abs and great noble savage features. And so so the fact that Hitler so valorized him and so idealized, this is the perfect warrior, but yet of course was a white supremacist. I mean, and he actually borrowed specifically, explicitly, some of the techniques he learned from what happened in North American genocide with indigenous people, and he actually applied them directly to what he did as a Nazi. So, Manifest Destiny, like clearing the way west. So basically making space for settlers. It's exactly what Hitler, and explicitly made the connection between a Liebestraum, making living room to move east and clear out space for Aryans. So the fact that there was those two things kind of blew my mind as a connection.
Right.
And also the fact that, the Holocaust is considered the paradigmatic genocide in many cases. So in what way can I use that to maybe not only to talk about the Holocaust, but to also unpack something else about Indigenous genocide? How can we learn from, how can each speak to each other in some way that maybe is useful? So, so I imagined my protagonist, Motl, also being in love with Westerns. So he's this Lithuanian kind of a schlub of a Jew. He's sort of middle-aged, not doing much, but he fantasizes, kind of like Don Quixote, thinking about being a knight. He's thinking about being a cowboy, and he's sort of the Clint Eastwood, doesn't speak much, is very macho, so then he's imagining the world through that, and partially because to deal with the real world, to deal with the anti-Semitism and the awfulness, is in a way he could retreat to this sort of fantasy world. And then also I wanted to make it a quest, and because cowboy narratives often have Western, they're always searching for something. They're going into the Badlands to find, whatever, that kind of thing. And also I really wanted to find something also funny. I'm really interested in using humor as a way of exploring a lot of serious issues, and we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. So I had the idea then, especially because the Western is like, and I would say Nazism is all about this sort of adopting tropes of masculinity.
Yep.
So I had the idea then, 20 years before, when when Motl was a young man, he ends up in the mountains in Switzerland, and he has a kind of shootout and accidentally gets his testicles blown off. They fall into a glacier and freeze. So his quest during the Holocaust is to go across Europe and to retrieve his testicles. The idea is sort of in the face of all of this death, he's going to create life that's worth having. It's worth living. It's worth having children in the face of death. It's like the most sort of having confidence in life, that it's worth, like, a life is worth living. It's worth bringing a life in. And there's also the idea of the macho thing about him being able to, be a man and not shooting blanks and all of that stuff. So I mixed those things together. So that's basically where the whole thing came from.
It works. I mean, it works very well. I'd never heard of Karl May before. Where did you stumble across his book?
I think I had, I guess I'd been researching, doing some research about Nazis, and I came, it's strange because he's not very well known in North America. He's hugely well known in Europe.
Right.
There's that phenomena which I was always fascinated. Maybe this is one of the other ways that I came across him, was there's all these Europeans who dress up as indigenous people, and they go on this kind of cosplaying indigenous people, and they which is amazing. Like, that, it would make our heads explode in North America. I mean, it's so strange. They dress up and they take it very seriously, and they become quite knowledgeable, even though they're these Europeans who are the Europeans appropriating indigenous identity. And so that is also very strange. And what is the fascination about the Western and about indigenous people? So other than just sort of Orientalism or exoticism, like, there's something that's really deeply connecting to European culture. So that was kind of fascinating. At the same time as, like, okay, how can you possibly do this? So I was interested in that. When I was researching, I was about halfway through the book, I came across Drew Hayden Taylor has this great documentary he did for CBC called, I think it's called Finding Winnetou.
Right.
And so Drew is an indigenous guy. He goes to Germany, and he's hanging out with these, we call them Indianers, so they're cosplaying indigenous people. So Drew is sort of dressed in regular North American clothing, and there are these people in headdresses and standing like this. And I don't know if they're saying how, but they might as well. And Drew is just looking at the camera as the only actual indigenous person there, like, what is going on?
Right.
It's kind of an amazing thing. But it's, about what is identity, what is, how do you form identity, and what ways are we taught to role play and assume identities and use certain tropes of identity, whether it's masculinity, femininity, machismo, indigenous, European, Canadian, what is that, and how do we use those? How do we use stories to mediate ourselves, and how can we unpack that and decide who we really are, and not using them as a kind of a screen between us and our real selves and the world, I would say.
Well, I definitely have some questions about that later, but I do want to chat a bit about, I mean, there are other than Karl May, there's other writers that appear in your book as well.
Yes.
I would love if you could talk to us about the Vilna Paper Brigade.
Oh, yeah. I love the idea of, well, first of all, there were people who were resistance fighters. They were partisans, and they were fighting against the Nazis, and the two of their leaders were poets. So I just love the idea. You think, oh yeah, like a poet's completely kind of ineffectual in the real world. But we all know that's not true. But so Avram Sutzkever is one of the most famous 20th century Yiddish poets, and he was one of the lead partisans. So there's pictures of him as carrying a gun, and he was fighting. They were blowing up railroads. They were doing a lot of resistance to the Nazis. And one of the things they also did is they were getting important Jewish documents that were going to be destroyed by the Nazis and bringing them into the ghetto and hiding them. there was all sorts of people. This is the paper brigade. They were bringing these books and protecting them. And there's, I mentioned in the book, there's some Chagall drawings that
Yeah.
they some prints that they get, and these are all historical things that happened. So the idea that they knew that one of the ways you preserve a people is through its language, through its stories, through its books, and they wanted to preserve these things, and so they did at great risk. There's a story I tell in the book. It's a Sutzkever story where, just in terms of how much he believed in the power of literature, he was standing at the edge of a minefield. The Nazis were on one side. He has to go across the minefield if he's going to not to escape, but he doesn't know where the mines are. He's going to die if he goes across. And I heard him. I watched a video of him as an old man in Israel telling the story. So he says he didn't know how to cross the field. So what should he do? Well, he's going to step across in the rhythm of poem, because it made as much sense as anything else did in the verkauft world that he was in. So he steps across and he survives by doing the rhythm of the poem. And then in the video, he says, that was, I wish I could remember what the poem was, because it might, now, because it might be useful again, right? so great. But yeah, I mean, just that they were so deeply cultured. So many people in the ghetto, they were doing readings. They had newspapers. They had, I quote a song. There was they had a songwriting contest in the Vilna ghetto, and they wrote this beautiful song that became a bit of an anthem. And like they really created a lot of culture.
Well, I understand that Vilna before that was an exceptionally cultured place. It had library. It was what it was called the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Am I right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Or maybe even of the north, I think. Yeah,
okay.
Because it was a center of Jewish learning and culture. I think there was like 100 synagogues in, and one of the things I wanted to write about in the book was people know about the Holocaust and they know about the camps and but people know less about what happened in the Baltics, in Latvia, and in my family's from Lithuania, and almost 95% of Jews were killed. Like there were less people there, but more percentage. And the other difference, so this was this flourishing culture. And the other thing that was very different was that the Lithuanians were involved. The Nazis kind of there was a lot of anti-Semitism. The Nazis were very able to use them, and the Lithuanians themselves did most of the killing, which was done by shooting people mostly. So really like direct person to person kind of thing. Really, really awful. And so I remember my grandfather talking about this. My grandfather, who left before the Holocaust, but grew up in Lithuania and then left as a young man and moved. But talking about how Lithuanians and Jews had lived together for many centuries, and then here's the Lithuanians turned around and killed all the Jews. So that idea that they were living so together, but yet, but that could happen. So what was that? And for me, I also really wanted to write about my family's history. They didn't really speak about it. And also the intergenerational trauma, like how does that pass down in the family? My grandfather never spoke about it. That was the one time he said anything, was that what I just said, which he did at my wedding. We had this videographer back in the days before filming people was very common, and it's
right.
like, okay, this is now something I need to make a statement for, because this is an important family event. I'm going to record this for history. And so he said something, but he said, I am going to address the nation. He was joking, and then he said he looked in, and I could see the level of pain, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, his parents were killed, his siblings. I mean, lots of people. I also had the opportunity to talk to my great uncle, his nephew, who had disappeared, and then my grandfather found him like decades later in Chicago. And he had literally, as a kid, had walked out of Lithuania. The Nazis were coming in, and his father said, because his father had to go find his sister, he said, go with your aunt and just walk out of Lithuania.
Right.
And he was walking out, and the Russians, what was happening was when the Germans were coming into Lithuania, then the Russians were leaving. So there was a Russian transport truck leaving, and they said, pass the kid up and we'll take him out. And so they passed this little boy. He was 7 or something, passed him up into the truck, and he escaped. And that's why, that's why he ended up living. So, that kind of amazing. So I got to talk to him when he was about 90 when I talked to him, my great uncle Isaac.
Part of this book, I understand, was written during lockdown.
Yeah.
And was your family there to help? How did you approach this material without being able to chat with people face to face? Or
Well, surprisingly, I mean, I did, like, before COVID, I was able to get to Chicago to talk to my,
okay, right,
so I had a like a really lovely, couple days just talking to him. He showed me photographs. He showed me, just, it was really, really, remarkable, and so lovely to have this connection. And also because he's my grandfather's nephew, he looked like my grandfather. So to see
right,
somebody in the world who looked he's an old Lithuanian man, just like my grandfather was.
right.
So that was lovely. And then a lot of it was, my family didn't really talk about any of this, and they don't even know that much. And that is something about, I mean, that's a kind of intergenerational trauma thing where they might know a lot about the Holocaust, but they didn't actually address, these are difficult things, and they actually didn't know much about or think much about our family in Lithuania. Like, it was like my great grandparents and all of the related people, and the little villages that got destroyed. And even I found out from from Isaac that my grandfather, though he left before the Holocaust, when he was a boy, because there was anti-Semitism, the Russians used to think that that the Jews were allied with the Germans. And so when around the time of the revolution, that they always find a reason to blame Jews, it seems, and they thought the Germans, were more allied. The Jews were more allied with the Germans. And so one of the things that the Tsar did in order to find a scapegoat was that they figured that it was it was a Jews' fault. And so they evacuated some villages, and my grandfather got sent into Siberia, like his whole village. So he was a young boy, and they just moved them all and then they burnt the village down. So my grandfather never mentioned that, but that was a thing that happened. And in fact, at the beginning of my novel, it's like a second chapter, third chapter, the family is sent to Siberia because that's what happened. They just took these Jews and they just moved them 1,000 miles east. So yeah, and it's so strange that they were actually legitimately, the Tsar and the Russian military were saying, those Jews, you have to be careful because they have the big beards and they hide radios in the beards and they communicate with the Germans. Like, they actually said that, they weren't joking. They this bizarre, overheated xenophobia or just plain racism, I guess.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so that was the situation. I mean, because the Jews were either allied with the Lithuanians were during the Holocaust thought the Jews were allied with Russia and they wanted to be independent. So they were allying with Germany because they thought maybe Lithuania could gain independence if Germany would let them be independent. And so whereas in the First World War it was the opposite. They thought the Jews were allied with the Germans, and so the Russians and the Lithuanians didn't like them for that reason.
I'm interested in hearing a bit about when the idea for this book began, this desire to
Yeah.
fill in this family history,
Yeah.
and sort of deepen your understanding of it, and also how it must have felt to finally be able to hear these stories and research this time and place, and how that must have felt like as a writer to be able to do that.
Yeah, I thank you. That's a really good question. I always as a kid growing up, understanding about knowing about Jewish history, about knowing that my grandparents were from Lithuania. They moved to South Africa, where my parents grew up. They moved to Northern Ireland, where we moved to Canada. So those are all places that have significant problems with persecution and racism, and so I guess that was always something that was that I thought about, but I didn't know how to engage with it, and I didn't really understand exactly. And I would say honestly, by listening in the last 5 years, maybe, to a lot of Indigenous authors in Canada talking about intergenerational trauma, talking about how people have been cut off from their past, their histories, and also saying, well, saying, don't appropriate Indigenous stuff, look back to your own heritage. And I guess I took that seriously to think about, oh, right. How does that filter through? What is it like for me as like, who am I, and how did I, here I am, and I'm at my desk in Hamilton, Ontario, right? It's 2020. How did I get here? I speak English. Why am I why do I speak English? Well, my grandparents didn't grow up speaking English. Like these are historical for a whole variety of global reasons. And so what is my connection to shtetls and to the Holocaust and to Yiddish and to all of that, so, and to think through that. So I guess it had been, that kind of inquiry had been building and engaging with ideas of what it is to be Jewish. Like, I'm not religious, but I'm informed culturally. And so my last novel was Yiddish for Pirates, and I really thought a lot about Jewishness, Jewish sensibility, a kind of Jewish epistemology, a way of seeing the world. That even though that book is set in the Inquisition, and it also addresses colonialism, follows Columbus into North America, but they speak Yiddish. And so how is a language, how is a language an archive of ways of seeing, of ways of being, of a culture, of your history? And so in that, the trope was, it was in Yiddish was the thing, and the parrot learned Yiddish, and so the parrot took on this kind of identity, or that was one of the pressures in the book. So similarly, I guess I was thinking about that, and about following the language back, and following history back, and understanding, so how is it that I am who I am, and how did my family get to be here, and get to be the way it is, like how, as a result of history, where all these forces are shaping us and shape our lives. My children were born in Hamilton, Ontario, right? Like, how did that happen, right? So if I was going back to my great grandparents and saying, oh, let me tell you, like, Gitl, your great grandson was born in Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada, speaks English. Like, what? Like, and how has tattoos? So like, how did that happen, right? So I think that's really interesting. And so I guess that was one of the ways in for me. And then once, all these things connecting, and humans are quite marvelous and wondrous, but we're also not.
Right.
Sorry to have to break the news to you. But so just sort of these historical wars and genocide and persecution and like, how is it that we get to a place like that? Like, I often think a lot about the nature of evil. I guess I just really don't believe in evil and that people are bad, but yet obviously there are these horrendous things that happen. So to begin to try and, begin to unpack some of that, like what could that be? That, like, how do we, how is it that people do these things? And you're not born as a baby. Well, everybody's born as a baby. When you're born, you're not born evil like this. I don't feel that that's in our hardware. It's something that comes with culture. And so to begin to take that apart, that's, I guess, been a concern of mine in the last two novels. Just really understand what culture does to us, and how we can, I guess, by knowing culture more, by unpacking it, by really thinking about it, about how we're subject to all of these historical and cultural forces, how we can unpack that and not follow along some of the things that we do, racism and colonialism and persecution and
Well, I do I've read in some interviews with you, and you talk about using language as a tool of agency.
Yeah.
And in particular, humor as a tool of agency. And I find that interesting. What are my notes here? Yeah, jokes are something that are constructed. You have to have agency over a joke. You have to perform it and tell it well, or intentionally badly to
well, or even
back.
the fact, even the fact that you're framing something as humorous means that you're asserting your perspective on the world, right? So even, I mean, never mind whether you can tell it, it's saying, I see the world this way, I see the situation this way, and therefore that absolutely it gives me agency. And also I might imagine telling this, so I'm building a community with somebody because I might imagine sharing this perspective with somebody.
Yeah.
Because jokes, I think, on humor, not entirely, but in a large part, they presuppose kind of an audience, someone to share it with, I think, even if only theoretically.
Oh no, my 9-year-old practices his jokes. I can hear him in his bedroom
Oh,
practicing
it's so
jokes.
great.
Then
I
he
love that.
bursts out and like tries them out on us, and is so satisfied when they go well. So
No, there's something so pure about jokes, about that as a formal structure. I mean, they set up expectation, they set up there's pacing, there's formal play always, there's variation, there's a deep connection to culture, all of that. And so I do think about how humor is, well, humor carries culture with it, and it forms agency, and it is a way of I mean, it is speaking truth to power in a way of destabilizing narratives, for sure. Like, even like I was telling you the story of Sutzkever and the and walking across the minefield. The fact that, I mean, obviously he was going to be killed by the Nazis. He was in mortal terror of crossing this minefield, and somehow, at least in retrospect, some part of him can tell this as a kind of a joke. Like, I wish I could remember this,
yeah,
and
yeah,
so he, like, it's consoling, and it does give him a kind of agency. Not to say that he doesn't like go home at night and shudder with fear and
yeah,
grief. I mean, I don't think that it means just because something is, you can find humor, it doesn't mean it's not all or nothing. You
yeah.
absolutely can see the complexity of a view, but it's just one thing where you can uh, carry some. It's a technology of hope, of possibility, um, of like, it's an epistemological tool. It's a way of being able to see things your way, and not the way you're told to see them, I think. And
Yeah.
it's, and to me, and thinking about a lot about Jewish. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please. That sounds interesting.
No, I was just gonna, no, it's not really, but you know, but no, I was thinking a lot about Jewish humor when I was writing Yiddish for Pirates, and how it's used as a real teaching tool, as a bit like a Zen koan, where it's deliberately paradoxical, or it pulls the carpet out from underneath you, so that you have to then rebuild your view of things.
Mhm.
Rabbis
Yeah.
will often start sermons with kind of a joke, right? And there are a lot of kinds of things um, that are like jokes that are part of the Jewish tradition, that are a way of helping you learn things. I know one thing that I like to think about. There's in the Seder table, there's a bunch of different things that represent, for Passover, different symbolic things. One, the salt water, that's the tears of, or the bitter herbs, the bitterness and sadness of being slaves in Egypt. There's, certain things, and they're symbolic. And then, but there's two bitter herbs. And so my kids asked, which evidently was a traditional thing for kids to do, how come there's two bitter herbs? Like, what? And so we looked it up, and one of the traditional answers that the rabbis say is, so that children will ask questions, which is kind of like a joke, right? I mean, it's sort of like a punch. But the idea that humor has you ask questions. You have to say, how does all this fit together? What is, like, and am I accepting that? And what is the point? So that idea of, for me, of negative capability, of asking questions rather than knowing answers, and always being in that kind of active, engaged curiosity with the world, to me, is built into a lot of humor, and certainly to Jewish humor.
So I watched an interview with you and Bill Richardson, and it inspired a question that, seriously, on my page here is like this big, because there's so much to. Forgive me if I ask this question improperly, but where is it here? Yeah, certainly online now, there's communities who, I think of the repulsive communities on 8chan and so on, who actively try to minimize genocide, particularly North American genocide, European genocide, and they're creating a narrative that is weaponized and they're using narrative techniques to weaponize their the thoughts of their followers. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how how storytelling is being used this way to to become a weapon instead of a method of healing, which that sounds very different. In particular, QAnon and the uh, I guess my question is, how do you as a writer approach a story when it is a tool that can be a weapon, but can also be an object of healing?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, I think because absolutely, I mean, they're appropriating stories, appropriating language, and sort of like perspective. Like it's about freedom. It's about, I mean, like they all of a sudden they're persecuted, like these white supremacists are persecuted, and they're looking for they take on, and the right to your own body, right? They take on these fundamentalist progressive ideas and use them as in right-wing ways. So the Western's an example, which is, I mean, I thought about this. The Western is a narrative. It's super appealing. I grew up watching, as a little boy in Ireland, watching Westerns and the Cowboys, and they are so cool, and it was this beautiful, formally limited world where certain actions happened and you expected them, and they were the sex worker women, like they come in their red thing, and they'd come down the steps, and there were the guys drinking, and then like everybody had a role, and it was played like an elaborate chess game, and it was really appealing. Like, I mean, all of it was so that's the stories that we're told, which also does things to people of color, and certainly to Indigenous people and to women, and to queer people. Like, they're written out of that narrative, which is not actually what it was like, and also it's a I mean, it's a colonial narrative, right? So there's a story that has been told. So now my job as a writer is, one of the things I can do is to look at that story and take it apart, which is kind of what I did with, I have this Eastern European Jewish guy taking on that narrative, but it once he actually is in the real world, it falls apart, and he understands that it actually is incredibly distorted. And when he actually meets real Indigenous people, and once he starts actually experiencing some of the issues that are at play in Westerns, like Manifest Destiny, like persecution and violence and gender roles, and once he actually is in the world. So one of the things I can do as a writer is to look at stories and narratives that are being that are in the culture, and to take them apart, to examine them, to think about them, and to resist, and also to resist their allure, because like cowboy stories are great. I love cowboys, even if they're based on this terrible thing. So like, not to allow that. And similarly with other kinds of stories that we're told, and like, who isn't represented, who should be represented, in what way is this setting up problematic tropes, or structures that, or it's amplifying structures that we resist. So yeah, maybe people QAnon, and well, they're trying to take over things, but we can take over their stories, and so in that sense, it's not that poetry doesn't make anything happen, or stories don't make anything. It does, because it's a powerful tool of understanding, and understanding what it is. Like, I'm this like middle-aged white guy, but I can think about what that is. Like, I'm not accepting the frame that I've been given. I'm a macho white supremacist colonial guy. I'm not, right. I mean, I'm resisting that, even though there's some things that are very alluring, right? Like, sure, I'd like to be James. When I was a kid, like, I want to be James Bond and be cool. Sure, of course, the reason they work is they're appealing, and it appeals to maybe your immature, weaker part, or just there's something. So it's like, okay, but how can I not only take that apart, but also then think about another way of telling it, sort of with a richness and an enticingness and a humor and intelligence so you say, okay, yeah, never mind, this is way more interesting. Like, that's what I look to in literature. It's like, it's a way better story. Like, I can tell a Western, but I'm going to make it way better, because look at and so QAnon is this tiny little sad, broken, ego driven thing. Okay, well, let's look at some of those things and like make it, so much more powerful and interesting and smart and funny, and like use all the resources we can as writers, as people in the culture, and that's gonna be better.
Well, I definitely feel, reading your book, it's a book that creates possibilities instead of limits them. And there's a sense, and perhaps this is your background in small press and your background as a poet, musician, and performer, but I mean, and forgive me if this is not correct, but there's a sense that the story went this way, like you're reading the book, but I have a sense reading the book that it could have gone any number of ways. Like there's so many different things that happen in the book. It's a wild story. Every scene doesn't seem to necessarily like the Westerns that you're talking about, where so-and-so comes down the steps and then, there's a guy at the bar, like, look at what we have here, like, like all sorts of things happen in this world that you're writing about. And that's a world of possibility and openness. Is that fair?
No, absolutely. And I think that's something about the basis of story, right? Like things can happen in the story that you wouldn't anticipate.
Yeah.
And it's not like there's necessarily this absolutely directed deep structure of the world that a story reveals. It is about possibility, and then making it work as a story, as a story. It's also a little bit like a picaresque in that it's like the Westerns are, that they do these different things happen in mine. But I really do think that part of it is, for me, I'm interested in the storiness of a story.
Yeah.
Because that's like not just to tell a story. I mean that too, but also to like, you're in a story, like, and that is something that, like, that's again the idea that we can, I guess, through our imagination, through our agency, we can, while looking at what's real and knowing the data, we can tell our stories and like draw, make connections the way that we want to. And that's a kind of an agency. I mean, different ways of wonder, excitement, engagement, analysis, all of that, right? So yeah, I do think, to me, that's something that a lot stories and a long novel allows me to do. That is it's really exciting. And in a way, my life went one way, it could have gone another. I mean, it just easily, whatever. I was talking about Isaac in Chicago. Well, if I had been his son and not somebody, or his grandson and not somebody else's, I would have had a very different life. And the difference, my father's father, supposedly I don't know if this is true or not, but he got a ticket to go to South Africa, a boat ticket that was supposed to go to his brother. So like maybe I would have, with that side of the family, stayed in Lithuania. So I think that the difference between one thing and another is not that much, but then we have to construct an understanding of what it means to be in that situation, I think.
Well, I do love the idea that we go across the field a certain way because we're humming a poem, but we can never remember what that poem is.
Yeah. So we have to make it up again, right? Or we just have to trust in poemness or whatever, or in something, right? Yeah.
That we're going to go to a Q&A very soon, but there is one or two more questions I want to sneak in here before we do that. I do see questions popping up on the Q&A thing here, but yeah. In your book's acknowledgements, you mention long discussions with your daughter. I mean, I don't want to betray any confidence here, but I do appreciate this direction, how, a lot of the story of how this book came to be was about looking at, your grandparents' story and, learning about your family's history, but here you're turning to your own child and it's going in a different direction.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things you said that you put it in your book on subjects of genocide, Judaism, and indigenous society, and especially, and this is lovely, her commitment to thinking about what would make a just world. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that without betraying any confidence.
No, that's you mean like she's smarter than me? Yeah. No, but yeah, it is a really lovely thing. I really like the way you framed that, because I hadn't actually thought. I mean, it seems obvious to me now that you framed it. Like, yes, I'm looking back to my, people of the generation before me, but also looking forward. So absolutely. I mean, part of it is also like, okay, so where do we fit? I'm talking to my daughter, talking to my children, like, where do we fit in the world? How did we get here? Let's talk about how we see ourselves and what traditions we bring and what learning we bring from person to person and down the generations. And also to, so, I mean, a lot of it, we've had a lot of talks about identity, about Jewishness and identity in general. She did a human rights degree, so in terms of like actually knowing a lot and really thinking carefully about, and I guess helping me unpack assumptions maybe that I might have had. I think
Mhm.
just a different way of seeing it, and bringing kind of new language and new concepts, or solidifying sort of vague ideas I had of things, and having that discussion. And there's nothing to me that calls me to be more thoughtful or thinking like about the highest kind of ethical and moral imperatives than talking to my children like that like that and especially realizing that on the subject of taking down the patriarchy, though I'm the father, it doesn't mean that I actually know more about that. Like we really, that discussion back and forth I think was really, really revealing to me, I think. And, again, me telling the story as a middle-aged white guy, okay, talking to my daughter who is not a middle-aged guy, right? And so
Right.
that exchange, I think, was, and also somebody who grew up in I think, I feel like I grew up very in a diaspora, and my family moved around, but I feel that she feels solidly born in Canada. Like I grew up since I was a kid in Canada, and she was born here. Her mom's Canadian, like all of that. And so though I feel like I don't feel as grounded in this place and it culturally, whereas she does, and has a clearer sense. And I think that was another very important other perspective. And in general, yeah, it's that idea of looking back and looking forward is really, um, I think that's a powerful place to be in as a writer, to be able to be on the in the fulcrum between it. Oh, I just wanted to say one more thing, just the question you asked previously. I just thought of talking about storiness.
Yeah.
My grandmother used to make up all these stories. They weren't true. Like you'd ask her about something that happened in the family, and she'd make up all these things, and they were complete lies. And my parents explained, yeah, they don't, they're not true. But what I realized was that sometimes she would tell stories that reason she told the stories was she was trying to convey how she felt. Like
Right.
the story she had didn't convey but when she made it, that was more like she was being creative, right? That to
Right.
really convey the sense of it, or even the sense of how she thought the world should be in a way. And so, yeah, okay, I shouldn't rely on that for any sense of reality. Um, in an objective sense, but in terms of what her values were, what her vision of the world was, they were in the stories. Now, I agree that you should put them in a book rather than trying to tell your innocent, sweet, earnest grandson, you know, and passing it off as true, so he tells it to his bar mitzvah class. But I mean, I guess I see the power of story in that, and kind of understand why people are motivated to do that, and the wish to make the world the way you want it to be, right? Like
Yeah.
I can understand that.
That's interesting. No, I appreciate that. My last question, I have to sneak it in here because it's focused on London. You also, in your acknowledgements, thank the patrons of the London Public Library. And as a patron of the London Public Library, I want to, and a fan of the London Public Library, I want to just ask you a little bit about that. What did tell us a bit more about your gratitude to the patrons of the London Public Library?
Oh, it's big. It's big. No, I was writer in residence a few years ago at
Yeah.
Western and at the library. And again, all these things we've been talking about, talking to, of course, at Western, but we're talking to students, but in the library, we're talking to the public.
Yeah.
Just the idea of um, storytelling and books are marvels. Like what a thing it is that we humans can do, that we can do this. And so there was a sense when I was, as a writer in residence, I was talking to people about storytelling and about framing things in story, and how like people would like they really valued that. And sometimes it's easy to get kind of blasé or whatever. Oh yeah, books, and my book doesn't sell as much as this person's or that person's,
Mhm.
whatever stuff that writers do, as opposed to like, holy shit, like that's an amazing thing. Like, right, being able to do it, like tell a story, tell a joke is an amazing thing, right? It just like, never mind anything else. That is amazing that we are able to use language. We have language, we can use it, and it can do these things. There was a guy I saw at the library who I don't exactly know what was going on, but he clearly had some mental illness. But he would come in and he had a backpack full of these little stories he'd written and like all these little things, but he couldn't read what he wrote because I don't think they were in. I think that what he was doing was he was writing the form of stories and writing like the shape of books, but not being able to do it. But we were able to kind of just marvel together. I mean, it's kind of scenic writing in the avant-garde sense, but we were able to just marvel together at just the idea that there could be a story. Like here's a, like here's a book, between the covers is a story. Like we can share that, and that, that just really inspired me. It's like I want to live up to the idea of what that his books could be saying, right? Like that's, I guess, and that's part of what I was thinking.
That's fascinating. So I think we're going to turn now to the Q&A and see what our watchers are saying. Forgive me as I struggle with technology.
My daughter better be on there telling me how great, how lovely I am for acknowledging her.
Oh, excellent!
All the patrons of the public library, they better appreciate me.
They better, patrons, get on board and appreciate Gary's time.
Actually, it's lovely. It's lovely just to hang out in the library. I mean, that's one of the things I did, right? I sat in my office and hung out in the library all day. It was what a lovely thing to do, right?
What floor? What floor was your office on? Tell me about your office in the library. What? Actually, no. Let me ask you this question instead. Where was your favorite spot in the library? Where did you sit most often?
Well, I know I sit in my. I guess I would just sit in my office. I could look out and just see people. Like I was in the fiction section.
Oh yeah,
so
of course. Yeah,
it's just great. The favorite thing that happened in that residency was there was a woman who came from. She lived outside of Ingersoll, so like a small little town in southern Ontario.
Yeah.
She was not a student, but she came actually to Western. She came to see me in my office. West. She'd never been on the campus, and so she was from a little town. She said, she's an older woman, and she said, I want to write a story about being in southern Ontario and like about the lives of like women and of girls and the kind of complicated identity and sort of some of the sexual stuff that happened. And I could say, hey, have you ever, and I was talking about Dickens and she hadn't ever heard of Dickens. So and then I said, hey, have you ever heard of Alice Munro? She writes about the lives of girls and women in southern Ontario and some of those same things. And then so she had never heard of her. So she went and she read, then she went away and she came back a week later, like her eyes, this woman, like to me, it's like, I got to show this woman, this older woman who lived in southern Ontario.
That's wonderful.
Alice Munro, right? Like, how awesome.
A friend of mine used to grew up in Clinton, I believe, and in Clinton, Ontario, and this is shortly before, well, maybe it's about 10 or 15 years before Munro won the Nobel Prize. In Clinton, Alice Munro was known in town as that nice old lady up the street who wrote those stories.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that.
Do you know the story with, I know we want to get to other questions. Stuart Ross, the writer, was selling books on the street in Toronto, as he would do, like these small press, like weird, having signs like writer going to hell and selling his avant-garde books. And this nice old lady came up and wanted to talk to him about being a writer and wanted to buy his books. And she said, oh, he asked her, do you read? Do you write? Oh yeah, I write some stories. Yeah, would I have heard of you? He says, well, possibly. My name is Alice Munro.
Incredible.
So good.
Let's see. Okay, folks, we're gonna get your. Okay, here we go. Pop them in the Q&A. Okay, here we go. Q&A. We have a question. Gary, this is from Reg Beatty. Gary, do you see a continuum across your novel writing and your experiments with concrete poetry?
Oh, cool question. Thanks. Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, I'm surprised that people don't want to try everything as writers. Like, to me, it's just like, well, why wouldn't I want to try concrete poetry and novels and, everywhere in between? But I do think that, as we spoke about, I really do think a lot about what can language do? What are our assumptions behind language? What happens if we do something different with it? And what can happen? What does that unlock? What assumptions does it unlock? And what other kind of creation possibilities are in that, whether we're, you know, incorporating sound or taking apart the words themselves or even the letters, or how do we think about the page, right? Like all of that. I mean, that to me, part of my interest as a writer and my role is explore explore language, right? And to see what, like, I mean, it is both like as some sort of scientist investigating it, be a more mad scientist kind of investigate, like you know, take language out on the road and see what can be done with it, right? Or cover myself all over with language and roll around in it and see what happens. Like, I mean, I feel like it's the same thing, whether it's a novel or it's just looking at different like setting my calibration in a different place, perhaps. Like, I'm not, for the most part, taking apart words or looking at individual letters in a novel, but it's the same sensibility about thinking about what's possible in language and within the various forms or levels of language, I think.
I'm gonna ask what book are you currently reading?
That I'm currently reading. What book am I currently reading? You know what I've been I've been on a Percival Everett kick. He's an American writer, and actually I was just recommended, which I just finished. He wrote a Western, the name of which has just escaped my head. Oh, in God's Country. It's this astounding Western. It's hilarious and really, really chilling. He writes, it's a Western, and it's told from, and he's charming and funny despite himself. He's like a Western kind of guy. He's a real idiot. He's also a terrible racist, but he's sort of charming anyway. And then he ends up, but so you see it from his limited point of view, but there's lots of dramatic irony. He also is interacting with a kid and who's a young girl and a black guy, and you see all of the conventions of the Western embodied in him, and it's just like breathtaking. And I would say the very last scene, which is like two sentences, is one of those, you know, one of those endings where your jaw is just dropped. It just the whole novel just turns and becomes this. It completely blew my mind. It's so fantastic. So that's what I've been reading, and I just recently read his Bliff, and his book which is told by a hyper intelligent 5-year-old baby who is interested in like French criticism, like Derrida and like critical thinking. It's amazing. And another book he wrote called Erasure, which is also astounding, which is in the middle of it, there's like a parody of like it's a black scholar who writes a lot about Greek. It's interested in Greek myths, but then he decides he basically wants to be successful. So he writes a pandering novel set in the ghetto, in sort of ghetto speak, as if he's like a kind of black, using all kind of conventionalized black tropes, and it becomes this massive bestseller. But the book itself is the whole thing is fascinating and structurally really exciting. If you haven't checked out Percival Everett, I just learned about him recently, and man, what a revelation. He's such an exciting reader. Writer. Yeah.
Writer. Well, I've been reading this. This is a very good book.
I
really encourage you to read it, Gary.
I've been reading it too, and I've been fondling it a lot. I just was embarrassed to say so because, you know, it's just, you know.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to give my deepest heartfelt thanks for coming today on this lazy Sunday afternoon. Is it raining in Hamilton? It's raining. Well, it was raining here.
Just Greer.
Yeah. And what kind of dogs do you have?
Oh, you could hear them in the background, right?
Yeah.
I have a sheepadoodle, which is called Happy, who really feels a lot of emotional stress being called Happy because he's sort of melancholy, and I think we should have called him like something with a lot less pressure, I think, so that he doesn't feel like he has to try and be happy all the time, you know, like satisfied or moderately okay. And then my son has a dog my son has a separate apartment in the basement, but he has a dog that's a golden doodle, and they wrestle and play all day. It's been a great pandemic for them because they've just had time together to wrestle.
Awesome. And, yeah, I'm surprised my dogs haven't reacted to your dogs. They're currently, it's raining, so they're probably hiding under.
I've told this before, but my wife's a criminal lawyer at home doing court from our dining room table. So we have to keep the dogs. You can hear dogs on a literary interview, but not during court. But I remember one time the dog went. The judge heard the dog, and so it's like, oh, and so she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." It's okay. Dogs are allowed in this court as long as they tell the truth. Oh, it was pretty good for a judge.
That's dynamite. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, Jason, for your very generous, thoughtful questions. I so appreciate it, and for words for having me. It's so it's a lovely festival. I so appreciate being able to be here.
We hope to see you all, you in London, Ontario, in person sometime soon. Okay, take care, everybody.
Thanks. Yeah, be well, everyone.